Over the last 200 years, 3 fuel sources have revolutionised the world. These fossil fuels have driven industries to rise and fall, united and divided nations, sparked technological innovations, and ultimately shaped the future health of our planet. In this podcast, I speak to 3 experts about the role that coal, oil and gas has had in evolving British society and its energy use.
The rise of the use of coal is bound up with the British historical political story, really. So it's part of the whole British imperial project. And Britain was essentially the first sort of major economic sort of superpower in that sense.
We'll explore how these fuels not only drove early energy transitions, but also influenced geopolitical shifts.
There's a famous article from the Times newspaper around this time that said that the coal mining strike represented the greatest catastrophe to the United Kingdom since the Spanish Armada.
Hello, I'm Claire Nazir, and welcome to Inside Energy, a podcast series brought to you by Ofgem. Mark, can you hear us?
Yes.
Welcome to our Ofgem podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Mark McAllister is chair of Ofgem. Mark, first of all, why would you say this podcast is important?
The energy system is complex and it's about to enter the biggest transition possibly in history, but certainly one of the biggest transitions, certainly the biggest transition since the Second World War. And so it's quite difficult for people to really understand what's going on, understand the system, understand where it's going. And of course, there are a wide array of voices out there giving their opinions, some very, very partisan, some sort of polar opposite views. And I think Ofgem can bring an authoritative and an objective voice to help people to understand and work their way through the energy system. And not only is Ofgem objective, but also the deep expertise within Ofgem to do this. And one of the biggest surprises about Ofgem is from the outside, which is probably your perspective, Claire, it's the price cap once a quarter. That's what we are. We're the price cap people. But when you come inside, I call it the TARDIS. The range of the mission of Ofgem is so wide, from helping those vulnerable customers in the retail market, through managing the build of the network that we're going to need for the new energy system, through other things like heat networks, a wide array of things. So the depth of expertise within Ofgem is wide and deep. So I think between that objectivity and that expertise, I think we're in a very good position to help people to understand the energy system, what it is and where it's going.
We'll hear more from Mark across the series. In order to understand where the energy system is going, we need to understand how we got here. And so, our story begins with an early energy transition in the 1600s, when Britain's lush woodlands faced a dire threat, not from pests or fungi, but from the very fires that kept homes warm and cottage industries running. As the population grew and industries expanded, the demand for wood skyrocketed, leading to rising costs and an environmental concern for our forests. Out of this crisis emerged a subtle but transformative shift. Coal, once a minor player, began to take centre stage. By 1660, coal's share of energy generation had risen significantly, setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution. This transition wasn't just about fuel, it was about survival and adaptation in the face of scarcity. It took at least 120 years for coal to become a dominant force, culminating in Britain becoming a world leader in coal exports and innovation. A good time to introduce our first guest expert.
By the turn of the 19th century, coal was seen as the fuel of the future, the fuel of industry and progress.
Dr. Ben Curtis is a historian at Swansea University and specialises in the history of coal, in particular the South Wales coalfield and the coal industry.
Coal is essentially a form of carbon, and it's a mistake to think of it as being a single thing. There's a range of coals. Different types of coal have distinctive uses. Some of them are known as steam coal. The energy profile means that they generate quite a lot of heat. And there's other types of coal, which are like coking coal, which are suited for being used in furnaces for production of iron and so on. And so different types of coal grew up in different places around the UK and indeed around the world to service different industrial functions, essentially.
Utilising coal as a fuel became an obsession and is synonymous with names like Abraham Darby, Thomas Newcomen, James Watt, but others too.
Probably one of which we've not mentioned on that list here, which I think is really important in terms of this story, is Richard Trevithick, actually, because Trevithick's steam engine in 1804 was the world's first steam-powered vehicle. And so that's really where the modern transport era comes from.
Coal became the driving force of the Industrial Revolution. Building on early innovations, the pace of progress accelerated rapidly. The first commercial railway, the famous Stockton to Darlington Railway, opened in 1825. Just a few years later, in 1829, Stephenson's rocket came onto the scene, setting the standard for locomotives for the next century. As industry grew, so mining communities across the country began to thrive, connected by a growing network of railways and shipping lanes.
From a British perspective, the northeast of England and Scotland are two of the ones which are of quite historical standing. In South Wales specifically, the coal industry grows up to provide fuel for the metal industries, for the smelting of copper, for the smelting of iron. But into the 19th century, we start to have these developments in terms of steam-powered shipping and steam-powered railways.
From the 19th century onwards, steam-powered travel revolutionised the world. Market forces responded, and the British coal industry facilitated this change.
The phenomenal growth in demand for steam coal increasingly is what the South Wales coal industry orientates towards. And by the beginning of the 20th century, South Wales is the biggest coal field in Britain and the biggest coal exporting coal field in the world.
Coal was the foundation of the strong British economy, with mines littering the country north to south.
Essentially, the rise of the use of coal is bound up with the British historical political story, really. So it's part of the whole British imperial project. And Britain was essentially the first sort of major economic sort of superpower in that sense.
1912 to 1913, coal production peaked in Britain.
And there's a number of reasons for that, but largely complicating factors arising from the First World War.
In a moment, we will learn what pushed coal off its peak as war broke out. But let's jump forward to the end of the Second World War and the role of coal in providing electricity to the nation.
Coal continued to be central to British electricity generation in the UK right up until the 1980s. As late as 1960, 99% of all the energy generated in the UK was coal-fired, which just shows how absolutely dominant it was.
Back at the start of the 20th century, another fuel was making its mark.
This is when the age of coal collided head-on with the age of oil, and oil won.
Introducing Ian Werreley, the adjunct research professor of the History of Energy at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He's also the adjunct curator of the History of Energy at the Canada Science and Technology Museum, also in Ottawa. Firstly, Ian wants to put the record straight.
The common narrative is that it was an American named Colonel Edwin Drake in Pennsylvania who launched the modern age of oil. And if you read historical texts, public history texts, the internet, you'll see Colonel Drake as the main character. But if you dig into the historical evidence and look at the facts, it was actually a year earlier in the province of Ontario, Canada, where the first discovery and mining of oil took place. And it's a real kind of highlight in Canadian energy history and the history of the British Empire.
So the Canadians got there first, basically.
So in the early 1850s, two enterprising entrepreneurs, Charles and Henry Tripp, these two brothers learned of a deposit of gum beds from a local indigenous tribe in a forest in southwestern Ontario. And in 1851, they began extracting the tar or bitumen from those beds. And by 1855, they had developed a technique to refine that tar into kerosene and asphalt. And they actually won a prize at the International Exhibit in 1855 and received an order from the city of Paris to pave their streets with the asphalt. The main date that started it all was in 1858 when those two Tripp brothers sold their property to another man named James Miller Williams, who was the first person to actually drill into these deposits and struck oil below the surface. And it was the first time in North America that drilling equipment had been used to extract oil. And he began what is now the first true oil company that was dedicated specifically to the extraction and refining of oil.
It wasn't until the mid-19th century and the onset of what is termed the Second Industrial Revolution that we begin to see the advances in science and technology that allowed crude oil to be refined into useful products. A clearer understanding of molecular chemistry opened the door to exploring what could be done.
This is often called the age of lighting. And it was actually another Canadian/Brit, Abraham Gesner, who in Nova Scotia in the 1840s began tinkering and refining with coal oil, which is kind of a form of hydrocarbon. And he invented and coined the term kerosene, which was a really brilliant lighting substance. It replaced whale oil, which had been the common source of fuel for lighting in the early 19th century. And so the age of lighting took off, and you had lamps being produced all over the world, sent all over the world. It extended the working hours of the day. It allowed for people to enjoy the evenings in their house. So this lighting revolution was kind of the first use of petroleum on an industrial and global scale. And once the lighting revolution took off, other revolutions came in behind as the science and technology of oil developed. Of course, you had petrol for cars and automobiles. You had heavy diesel oil and fuel oil for maritime and naval purposes. So all of these kind of smaller revolutions took place after this initial moment of discovery.
Cityscapes began to light up. A culture of working late seeped into society as people's circadian rhythms shifted.
Kerosene lighting and then later electric lighting did revolutionize urban life in cities and how accessible and how they could be used, how safe they were. And that also then in turn led to a huge surge in urbanization at the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
After illumination came lubrication and a catalyst for further industrial growth.
If you look at what made the modern world possible in the 20th century, it was manufacturing and industry. And if you dig deeper into those fields, the number one product they needed was lubrication.
It was early in the 20th century when oil replaced coal as the transport fuel of choice.
This is where I got an entry into this field. I was quite interested in why the Royal Navy, under the leadership of Winston Churchill and another man named John Arbuthnot Fisher, why those two men decided to shift the Royal Navy from coal to oil in such a short amount of time and with such little public engagement.
Remember, Britain had built its global empire on the back of coal. During the mid to late 19th century, the entire world, in a sense, functioned off British coal. So why did a country that had this vast and critical network of energy switch to oil?
One of the key reasons that the Royal Navy, for example, decided to shift to oil was the technological superiority of oil over coal. Number one is that it was a liquid, so it could actually be moved around the ship much easier for things like ballast or in a defensive posture than physical coal. With oil, you could just hook up a hose and pump the tank full of oil in a relatively short amount of time. Another reason was the smoke. So coal produces smoke, especially at the beginning when it's the boiler's warming up. And in a naval battle, smoke gives away your position. So another benefit of oil was it was a smokeless fuel when burned, which created some benefits for fighting ships. There was also more energy in a unit of oil than there was in a unit of coal by calories. So you could create more energy, more power, drive the ships faster and for longer. So these were all to get that technological superiority or that edge over other battleships, for example, in the German Navy or in other competing navies.
Not that oil didn't have its drawbacks.
So if a battleship gets hit by a torpedo or a shell and its coal storage gets hit, then the coal just falls out. But if an oil storage tank gets hit by a shell or torpedo, the whole area explodes and lights on fire.
The 1910 to 1920 period in Britain is often referred to as the Age of Unrest or the Great Unrest, across industry, transportation, manufacturing, but particularly in mining and coal mining. But how much did this contribute to the early 20th century energy transition?
In 1911, you have a large general strike in the United Kingdom, which affected almost every industry. And 1912, you have the national coal strike. This happened over 37 days. It included 1 million coal miners on strike and the equivalent loss of 40 million working days over that period. That strike had a huge impact in the United Kingdom. So, for example, there's a famous article from the Times newspaper around this time that said that the coal mining strike represented the greatest catastrophe to the United Kingdom since the Spanish Armada. There was really the sense of an existential threat to the empire at large because of this coal strike. Now, eventually, the government stepped in. The strike ended on 6 April 1912. And a few days later, we know the Titanic made its maiden voyage. So over those 37 days, coal was basically not being produced. So the White Star liners that were going back and forth between North America and Europe were forced to reduce their speed. Their traditional sailing speed was 23 knots, and they reduced it to 20 knots to save fuel, to save on coal. And this apparently really annoyed the captains who liked going fast and making it on time to their destination. So they were a little bit grumpy about having to reduce speed. And then once the coal strike ended on the 6th of April, they were told they could bring it back up to 23 knots. And a lot of them did so quite enthusiastically. And perhaps some were too excited to go back to their regular speed and maybe not as cautious as they would have been. And we know that on the 14th of April, the Titanic collided with the iceberg partly because it was going too fast and couldn't turn in time. And we all know the results of that catastrophe.
2 days after the strike ended in 1912, the Royal Navy unveiled its first oil-fueled battleship. The First World War just accelerated oil technology. British imports of oil from 1913 to 1931 increased by 500%. The desperate search for this black liquid gold persisted.
It sent geologists all over the world, and a lot of them ended up going to places like Persia, which later became Iran, or the Saudi region, which later became Saudi Arabia. And so you have a lot of discoveries in these locations that were kind of not part of the British Empire. They weren't necessarily part of the global state structure. They didn't have their own states and governments, but they had local leaders and rulers that were then brought into the British Empire in a kind of informal way, or what I refer to as a kind of commercialized capitalism. This basically created the incentive for the United Kingdom and other imperial powers to go in to the Middle East and begin meddling with local rulers, local politicians, trying to play them off each other, all in that effort to extract and secure a supply of oil for the British Empire.
Over following decades, these complex relationships between British governments and companies and regions in the Middle East became even more tangled. And this is something we'll explore more in the next episode. A fascinating side story to this broader history of oil is the accidental discovery of natural gas. As oil forms, a gas pocket often appears on top. Nobody really knew what to do with this material. It was often difficult to capture and also tricky to store. And for the first 50 years of the oil industry, the natural gas was just released into the atmosphere. Remarkable that something now that is seen as so precious and valuable was deemed a waste product. In 1792, a lone and obsessed Scottish inventor, William Murdoch, became the first person to use gas extracted from coal for lighting by installing pipes to deliver gas to lamps in his home and office. Murdoch's discovery would eventually revolutionise lighting and heating.
So London was the first metropolis in the world to be lit by gas.
This is Professor Russell Thomas, award-winning scientist, energy historian, author, and also technical director at WISP. The first gas company was established in 1812, called the Gaslight and Coke Company. So began the use of commercial lighting, lit by gas, a world first.
And then other places followed suit. So Manchester adopted gas lighting, but in that case, it was adopted by the police commissioners, and they controlled the gas lighting for many years before the city council took over.
Like any fuel in its infancy, there was fear and backlash.
There was a lot of scaremongering, cartoons in the likes of Punch, depicting people being blown up by gas.
Early accidents led the Royal Society to conduct a review of the gas industry and recommendations about how gas holders, the vessels that stored the gas, should be housed in buildings and limited to quite a small size. This didn't deter the surge of gas use, the construction of distribution networks, or the importing from overseas. And soon the gas holders that stored the gas were redesigned.
There were plants which were imported from America where you could make gas quickly from heating coal and injecting steam into it, called water gas. Typical coal gas plants took 2 to 3 days to get up to speed to get functional, but you could get these water gas plants working quite quickly. And with that, you could also build larger and larger gas holders.
Gas holders became a familiar sight across Britain.
The early gas holders were rectangular or square structures. The ones that people would be familiar with and remember today were cylindrical structures. The original ones had just one cylinder inside them, but as time and technology evolved, they realised they could stack more and more cylinders inside of each other.
Both world wars had a huge impact on the gas industry. Large companies like the Gaslight and Coke Company lost key staff. The demand for gas was through the roof, from munitions to chemical byproducts such as TNT and motor spirit. In an unusual move of the time, women became an integral part of the industry.
There's photographs showing women working on everything from meter collecting to charging, cleaning retorts and digging out the purifier waste. So without the extra effort supplied by women during the war effort, the gasworks wouldn't have been able to operate. Unfortunately, after both the First and Second World War, most women went back to not working in the gas industry. A few did. Neath in South Wales kept on women gas fitters, but sadly the patriarchy took over there.
Innovation brought us gas meters, an early way of measuring the consumption of energy, something we'll return to in this series.
The problem with gas is that you could only get gas if you were deemed creditworthy. So it restricted a whole load of society from getting access to gas. So the advent of the prepayment meter in the 1870s and people being able to hire appliances allowed a whole new part of society to access gas, cooking, heating, lighting that they couldn't have before.
A rising industry with growing pains. Regulation was non-existent at the detriment of the customer.
Competition was always an issue in the gas industry because a company would make the gas and then supply it. So you couldn't really get much choice of who would supply your local gas. There came a time of uncontrolled rivalry in certainly parts of London where you'd have a number of different gas companies supplying the same area and everybody got confused as to which mains they're on, and it became very disruptive. So when they started allowing certain companies to only work in certain areas, there was no competition. So then that brought back people in the consumers movement trying to establish consumer-based companies that would supply gas cheaper. And the Great Central Gas Company, which was established to supply London, were a way of bringing the gas price down in London significantly.
Gas transformed industry and society. With a post-war population on the verge of a historic baby boom, the combination of regulation and innovation was imperative to feed the country's insatiable appetite.
After the Second World War, at the time of nationalisation, there were over 1,000 different companies or council departments supplying gas. Many of these were quite small and inefficient. So when they reviewed the gas industry, they realised the only way forward was to supply gas from larger, more efficient gasworks and supply that through regional gas networks.
To serve increasing demand, the search intensified for quality gas coals.
Natural gas has twice the calorific value within it as town gas. So by switching from town gas to natural gas, they would suddenly get an increase at least twice as much of the energy that they could supply around the country. in simple terms. One of the problems we did have is we didn't have any natural gas in the UK at the time, so that's why we looked to import gas as LNG. After the first successful trials in 1959 from the USA, we ended up having an agreement importing natural gas from Algeria. At that time, it couldn't be used directly, it had to be converted to natural gas. And to do that, we built a pipeline called the National Methane Pipeline, which stretched from the import terminal at Canvey Island up to Leeds and Manchester. So that would supply natural gas there as a useful feedstock for making town gas.
This all changed in the 1960s with the discovery of North Sea gas. Suddenly, from scraping around at imports, Britain had an abundant supply of offshore natural gas, which we could easily tap into. With almost an immediate uptick in the British economy, there was a sense of a return to the heyday of energy security and yet another nail in the coffin for the coal industry.
It was a huge game changer and enabled our switch away from coal, helped, make the country a lot cleaner. It led to a decision in 1966 that we would switch the whole gas network from town gas to natural gas, which was cleaner. It didn't have carbon monoxide, which was toxic within it, and it didn't require the polluting processes that you needed in town gas manufacture.
There began a nationwide conversion programme and then the onset of central heating as natural gas became more abundant.
In the years from 1967 to 1977, they had to have a team of around 10,000 gas fitters switching appliances across the country, domestic, commercial, industrial appliances. Then people started to adopt gas central heating, and you get to the level today that we've got of around 80% of homes being connected to the gas network.
And this sets the stage for the modern era of gas, privatised in the 1980s and now driven by market forces.
The outcome in the first 10 years or so of privatisation was indeed that costs came down.
Akshay Kool is Ofgem's Director General on Infrastructure. In the next episode, he talks about the privatisation, the dash for gas, and what this meant for consumers.
By the time you get to about 2010, you could start to choose which energy supplier supplied you with gas and electricity. So competition really had a big sway in policy and regulation, extending into virtually every aspect of a previously state-owned monopolistic energy industry.
My thanks to Dr. Ben Curtis, Dr. Ian Werley and Professor Russell Thomas, and of course, Ofgem Chair Mark McAllister. Join me in episode 2 as we delve into the next explosive era of energy with 3 incredibly insightful experts. I'm Claire Nazir. Inside Energy is a Bengo media production for Ofgem.